Okay, here we are again with Professor Graham Oppy, and in this video we will address the three arguments proposed by William Lane Craig, according to which if the universe has a cause, then it is most likely personal cause. A lot of the discussion about the Kalam argument focuses on the first stage, but I think the conversation should shift more toward the second stage, at least in my view. So before we begin, Professor Oppy, I'm curious whether you are agnostic about whether the cause of the universe, of course, assuming that it has one, is personal or non-personal. Or do you think it is certainly not personal? So if it's the latter, is there a specific reason to think that?
So, okay, so let's start with the universe. If we think of the universe as just being our what's called the observable universe, right? And if we think that that's all there is, then in my view, it doesn't have a cause, right? So my view would be there's the question about whether it has a personal or impersonal cause is just lapsing. On the other hand, if we think that the universe is part of a multiverse, perhaps because we think that there's kind of eternal inflation and different bits are inflating at different points in time, then we'll think that that our particular bit does have a cause, but that cause will be just some kind of physics, right? Some kind of physical cause. It won't be a personal cause. These are not the options that Craig's thinking about. So Craig's thinking that we have our universe, and then we've got something that's quite different from the universe that's a cause of it, right? And then the question is whether that cause is personal or not. And one way to think about the dispute there is to contrast Craig's view with the view of Aquinas, because Aquinas doesn't think that the first cause is literally a person, right? It's only in some analogous sense that the first cause is personal for Aquinas. It's not, right? The category of the personal simply doesn't apply to Aquinas's God. Right. So that would be, I think, a useful way of thinking about one kind of position that Craig is arguing against when he insists that it's personal. Yeah.
Yes, I could read one by one arguments. So let me quote him. He says the first reason causal explanations come in two types: scientific explanations in terms of laws and initial conditions, and personal explanations in terms of an agent and his intentions. For example, if I walk into the kitchen and see a kettle boiling and ask Jan, why is the kettle boiling? She might say because the heat of the flame is being conducted through the copper bottom of the kettle, causing the water molecules to vibrate faster until they become steam. Or she could say, I put it on to make tea. Would you like some? One is scientific explanation, the other is personal one. Both are legitimate, but they apply in a different context. Now, when we talk about the first physical state of the universe, there cannot be a scientific explanation in terms of earlier conditions and natural laws because there are no prior physical conditions. It's the very first physical state. So the only kind of causal explanation available is personal explanation involving an agent and his will, which gives us personal creator. Sorry, it's a longer quote. So yeah.
Right. So there are explanations that you can give that are not causal, right? So this is true even in science. There are structural explanations, but there are other kinds of explanations that we might countenance when we're doing metaphysics. And so you might think that the universe exists because it's necessary that it exists, right? For example, and so the explanation of the existence of the universe is just that it had to exist. Right? So, and this is a style of explanation that Craig himself wants to employ because he thinks that God exists, because it's necessary that God exists. Right. So it's we're not, it's not that we're limited to the two types of explanation that Craig's put on the table here, scientific and personal. We can explain the existence of the universe in other terms. Now, you might think, but the Kalam syllogism specifically was supposed to get you to the conclusion that there was a cause of the existence of the universe. And if you think that the Kalam syllogism is good, then you're going to think, so we're looking for a causal explanation. So let me come back and say something about that before returning. So there are two, we can distinguish between personal explanations and impersonal explanations or non-personal explanations. But by my lights, the domain of personal explanation is quite limited. The universe is quite old, 13.82 billion years roughly. There were no persons up until quite recently, right? And the kind of domain of personal explanation is really limited. And there's kind of no reason to think, in my view, that there's going to be a personal explanation for the cause of the universe, given what we know about persons and the kinds of things that they can do and so on. So I would think that if you're looking for an explanation of the existence of the universe, you'll be doing much better not to be looking for a personal explanation, but certainly not looking, well, depending now, maybe you're looking for a causal explanation because there's a multiverse, but if not, you're not looking for a causal explanation either. You're just satisfied with appeal to necessity.
Very good. The second reason that Dr. Craig puts is, quote, the cause of the universe must be timeless, spaceless, changeless, and immaterial. There are only two kinds of things that fit this description: abstract objects like numbers and unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects do not stand in causal relations. That's what makes them abstract. The number 7, for example, doesn't cause anything. Therefore, the cause of the universe must be an unbodied mind, a personal being. What is your response?
So I don't think that there are any unembodied minds. So I think we can rule that out as an explanation for the cause of the universe. But I'm curious about the must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and so on. If you're thinking of of multiverse and you're thinking that there really is a cause of the universe, it's going to be presumably material, and there's this bigger background space that has its own time, and so it won't be timeless or spaceless either. Right? So that's, now you might say, well, in that case, we should be thinking about that bigger space and thinking about the cause for it. But then we just go back to the previous conversation. You don't need a cause for it. It's enough that it's necessary. That's a sufficient explanation and doesn't require you to invoke a person.
Yeah, but maybe Dr. Craig wants to say that even if there is a multiverse, maybe God created it. Why don't consider that?
Yes, sure, he might say that, but I'm going to say, look, there's two issues. One is about the Kalam syllogism, whether we really want to say that the universe has a cause, and then there's this other question, assuming that we don't want to say that it's got a cause, we can still say that it's got an explanation. Right. Now, I think the question about whether it's got a cause depends entirely on whether we're thinking about our universe in a multiverse, or we're thinking about our universe on its own or the multiverse on its own, because in those two cases, there's no cause. Right. And but we will have an explanation in terms of necessity if we want to go that way, if we think that there's an explanation at all. Yeah, that's enough.
Thank you, Dr. Oppy. Now, third reason from Dr. Craig about cause, that it's personal. He says, quote, "It's the only way to explain how you can have an effect with a beginning arising from an eternal cause. If a cause is sufficient to produce its effect, and if the cause exists eternally, then the effect should also exist eternally. For example, if the cause of water freezing is the temperature being below 0 degree Celsius, and if the temperature had been below zero from eternity, then water would have been frozen from eternity. It couldn't begin to freeze only a finite time ago. So how do we get an eternal cause but an effect, the universe, that began 14 billion years ago? The only solution is that the cause is a personal agent with free will who can freely choose to bring about a new effect without any prior determining conditions. Just as a man who has been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up, producing a new effect at a specific moment. So he says, conclusion, for these three reasons, I think we have strong grounds to believe that the first cause is not just an uncaused cause, it is a personal being, a personal agent who freely chooses to bring the universe into existence. End of quote.
So we've already talked about the first two. The third one, I think, is problematic because we need an account of eternity and what happens to God in eternity, and in particular, what happens when God makes this decision to create. Right. So there's a literature out there that tries to make a case that there's something inconsistent or incoherent in the story that Craig is telling at this point about his divine cause. The thing that's hard to understand is what the structure of eternity is supposed to be. Because if there's a kind of before and after in eternity, so that it has a duration, then there are kind of Leibnizian questions. Why didn't God create earlier? Right? Why did he wait for an infinite amount of eternity to elapse before? On the other hand, if eternity doesn't have any duration, then it's kind of that's puzzling too, because then that suggests that there's just a beginning, right? There's this single thing that's an absolute beginning, and God has a beginning, right? So now maybe there's some sophisticated story that you can tell about God's relationship to eternity that avoids both having kind of infinite elapse and having an absolute beginning. But I'm not sure that I really understand what that story would be.
Excellent. That's it. Thank you, Dr. Oppy. And we hope that Dr. William Craig will see this video and respond so that the discussion and argumentation might be further improved, of course, in good spirit. Until next time, warm greetings from Serbia.